Hey guys, it's Timothy here with part 2 of my analysis of the draft archetypes in Conspiracy, Take the Crown. As a quick reminder, even though I mentioned it in the last video, if you watched that, I'm not going over every single color combination in the set because some of the color combinations don't amount to a very well-defined theme. I am, however, going over those themes that I think are well-defined and are supported very well, something you can go in having a game plan of and draft at your first conspiracy draft. Now, keeping that in mind, perhaps these videos should be called an analysis of sub-themes instead of archetypes, since there are a lot of sub-themes that aren't necessarily based on color, but rather some sort of action that you're doing in the game, for instance, playing defensively, playing control, so on and so forth. But I am going to do it by color for the most part. So we're going to jump right in to blue-red, and I will start by saying I think blue is pretty deep in this set. I think that it has controlling elements. I think it has aggressive elements. So I think there's a lot of direction that blue can take here, but I'm going to be looking at blue-red as an archetype that's focused on casting spells, mainly instants and sorceries, and using the goad mechanic to let your opponents do the dirty work for you. So you're going to want some early game, not necessarily defenders, but walls, so to speak. Creatures that can muck up the board, whether they fly or not, and let you just do some spell casting without allowing your opponents a good entry to attack you. Coveted Peacock shows us that goad cards are actually pretty good. In fact, I think most of the goad cards in this set are highly playable, with the Peacock being a very good example of a decent creature that has a pretty nice ability tacked on. Just for the record, the way goad works is when I attack with a creature like Coveted Peacock and it tells me to goad target creature the defending player controls, I choose one of their creatures and it must attack during the next combat phase that it's able to attack in, at least until your next turn. But it cannot attack you unless there's no other person to attack or no other way for them to attack another player. So it lets you choose which of your opponent's creatures you want to lock down as defenders. It gets them out of the way so that you can attack through them, and it also forces them to attack other players. So using the goad mechanic strategically lets you use your opponent's creatures against your other opponents, like I said, essentially making them do the dirty work for you. Finally, there's a mini spellcasting theme, which is very much highlighted by the inclusion of a card like Kiln Fiend. Remember that if you've ever played Modern, you've probably run across some brew decks that use Kiln Fiend and the like to take out opponents in one fell swoop. I do believe that is possible here. It's not a highly supported theme, but I feel like some combination of spellcasting and goading would make for a very strong red-blue deck in this format. Now, what do you want to be drafting in order to make use of this? First off, you're going to need the creatures that actually goad your opponent's creatures and some combination of blockers. Again, they don't necessarily have to be the best things in the world, but you need things that are going to slow the game down or at least stop opponents from attacking into you constantly, making aggressive decks a poor matchup for you. Or rather, you a strong matchup against aggressive decks. So we see Jiren Homunculus is a very good example of a lot of things the color wants to be doing. First off, it adds a really big butt to the board, making it really hard for early game interaction, while also goading a creature and forcing an attack on another opponent. Same goes with cards like Vertigo Spawn, which don't affect the board too much, but give your opponent a little bit of pause when they go to attack you, since they might have to lose a turn of attacking if they want to attack into you and into cards like Vertigo Spawn. In addition, there are a few spells matter cards in the set, namely, in addition to Kiln Fiend, there's also Mnemonic Wall and Gutter Snipe, which fit this strategy very, very well. Mnemonic Wall takes double time here by being a defender in addition to getting a spell back, and Gutter Snipe is an actual strategy to try and kill opponents. I can imagine a draft where people try to take as many Gutter Snipes as possible. In fact, it's extremely powerful, and as I've mentioned in a lot of these conspiracy videos so far, if you can interact with all opponents simultaneously, you're probably doing a very good job at the table, as opposed to just interacting with one opponent at a time. Spreading out damage with cards like Gutter Snipe, which does in fact deal damage to each opponent, makes for a really, really quick and not flawless, but very strategic way of approaching a four-player game. Finally, you're going to want some sort of spells, obviously. You're going to want instants and sorceries, namely cantrips, cards that'll draw you into more gas. If you're going for some sort of gutter snipe kill or some sort of kiln fiend kill, which is really awkward to say, by the way, you're going to want a critical mass of spells, especially those that draw you into more spells. Besmirch is a pretty nice spell. It's an act of treason type effect, or a threaten type effect, if you will, that also has the goad mechanic tacked onto it. So it lets you get a big hit out of whatever the biggest creature on board is. It lets you cast a sorcery, triggering your gutter snipes or kiln fiends or what have you, and also forces another creature to attack a different opponent during that creature's next combat phase. So it does pretty much everything you want to be doing in this format. Also, there's a couple, or quite a few cantrips actually, including some more poor choices like Fleet and Memories, or not Fleet and Memories, but Fleet and Distraction, which isn't a particularly strong card, but you get the point. A lot of cards that cantrip very, very cheaply, with Repulse being actually a more expensive cantrip, but a very good card on its own, and Illusion of Choice being a little bit more of a situational card. Serum Visions obviously being a very good cantrip. Combine these with your gutter snipes, and you might just be able to pull off a kill without ever having to send a creature into combat. Seems like a pretty nice strategy, and at least a shell of a strategy. If it's not the most well-defined, it is a little bit eclectic and all over the place, but it does give you some win conditions in a multiplayer game. As always, I like to check out the rares that you should be on the lookout for if you find yourself drafting this strategy. The first one is Psychosis Crawler, and obviously Psychosis Crawler fits into any deck, but the fact that you're playing a deck that really wants to cantrip and really wants to draw more gas makes Psychosis Crawler a little bit more appealing here. Remember, if you're playing cards like Gutter Snipe and you're trying to go for the damage kill rather than the combat damage kill, and you're just trying to play it safe, Psychosis Crawler does add to that damage. And in fact, if you have a critical mass of draw spells, Psychosis Crawler gets a lot better. Cards like Divination start dealing damage to your opponent when you have this little guy on the field. The only downside to Psychosis Crawler is that if you're ever empty-handed, he does die, but obviously you want to keep a couple cards in your hand in this case. I think this artifact creature is decent enough to play in most decks, especially since it does interact with each opponent, regardless of what kind of deck you're playing, but I think it gets a lot better in a blue-based deck that's going to be drawing a lot of cards. Arcane Savant is a really interesting card, and while he's good in pretty much any kind of blue deck, he is especially good in a deck that wants to cast spells because he gives you the opportunity to cast an off-color spell you might have drafted. For instance, if you're in a solid blue-red deck and you're not splashing, you might have a very strong green or black card in your sideboard. You can use Arcane Savant's ability to cast that card when he enters the battlefield, so long as you fulfill the conditions of showing it to everybody ahead of time and yada yada. But I think Arcane Savant makes for a very interesting choice and a little bit of flexibility in what you can draft while you're in the actual draft. Charmbreaker Devils is a dead giveaway that there's an instant sorcery spell-based deck. It fits very, very nicely. It's a very good card advantage machine, and similar to Kiln Fiend, it has the potential to just kill a player out of nowhere. It gets +4/+0 whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, which is not a negligible amount. While it is a little bit below average, being a 6-mana 4/4, if it ever survives a turn cycle, it's just going to start cycling cards. Whether you're getting cantrips off this or pretty much any sort of spell that you would like to cast again, it's going to do its job very, very nicely. And if you're playing it alongside cards like Gutter Snipe, Kiln Fiend, you can kill opponents very, very quickly. Burn and Wish is a card that I'm willing to bet is not actually very good, but the fact that it's a sorcery that lets you grab another sorcery from your sideboard means that you're essentially casting 2+ spells in a given turn, meaning Burn and Wish deals 2 damage off of Gutter Snipes to all opponents and almost guarantees you're going to grab another card out of your sideboard. So if you do have some cheap cantrips, for instance, maybe some poor ones like Fleet and Distraction in your sideboard, maybe the Voden card in your sideboard, forget the name of it even though we just looked at it, then Burn and Wish can help you with start off a flurry of spells and can help you cantrip into essentially another spell, dealing damage through your Gutter Snipes and your Kiln Fiends and just allowing your Charmbreaker Devils to go crazy. Covenant of Minds is a card that I don't think is actually that strong. It has a lot of text, but 9 times out of 10 I essentially see it as boiling down to 5 mana, draw 3 cards. There are times where it will draw you 5 cards instead, but I see those as being few and far between. Of course, depends on the minds at your table, but Covenant of Minds is it's very least a 5-mana draw 3, which is still okay. Maybe not exciting for a rare, but that's exactly what you want in a deck that wants to cast spells. Not only is it going to be its spell on its own, but it's hopefully going to draw you more gas, and if you're at the point where you can start casting additional spells in the same turn, you're probably in a really good spot. Not to mention, if you can recur this with Charmbreaker Devils or Mnemonic Wall, that's a lot of card advantage, and having more card advantage in a multiplayer game usually puts you ahead of the curve, and ahead of the other players if they're just in top deck mode. And finally, Desertion is just an all-around decent blue card. I include it here because if you're in the position where you want to be casting instants, or you're holding up cards like Repulse and instant speed tricks and things of that nature, maybe removal spells, then Desertion fits in your deck very nicely, where you can choose to maybe flash in a creature or cast Desertion on a spell worthy of stealing. It's, like I said, a card that probably fits into almost any blue deck, even though some blue decks can't afford to just pass the turn with open mana without doing anything. But Desertion, if it ever hits anything even remotely decent, it's definitely justified its spot in the deck. Moving on from red-blue, this is a little bit weird. So mono green's not really a viable strategy, I would say. It definitely is. You can force mono green, and as we'll see, there are a lot of rares that would push you into a green-based deck, but perhaps mono green should be renamed base green deck here. Obviously, if you're mono green, you can splash a couple cards here and there, a couple multicolor cards, and go either Gruul or Simic or even Selesnya if that's open. But the reason I say mono green is because most of those two-color combinations don't really have a theme to them, whereas mono green-based decks, or just green-based decks in general, are going to kind of follow the same rules here. So the idea is you want the biggest creature on the board. Sometimes this puts a target on your back in a multiplayer game, but if you can keep threats coming, there's very little your opponents can do about it. They'll get to a point where your opponents are no longer able to deal with your threats if you just keep slamming big creature after big creature. So you're just looking at massive, huge creatures, especially monstrosity creatures, which if the game goes long enough will dominate the board. Green has some of the biggest threats in this board, and while there are monstrosity creatures across every color, keep in mind green does what green does best, and that is ramp into threats earlier than all of the other colors. There are a few ramp cards in general, not very many in the set overall, but cards like Voyaging Satyr and I believe Explosive Vegetation is also in the set. These can get you ahead on mana and really take advantage of the board. And then finally, there's some number of pump spells that you'll want. There are, again, not very many, but the ones that are in the set can be used as really great finishers, especially since a lot of the green creatures are lacking trample. Giving them trample is exactly what you need to push through a certain number of board stalls, especially people who are making tokens and can set up a board position to block your creatures. So it's very simple. You want two things. You want the fatties and you want the finishers, or the spells that are going to help your fatties actually finish out the game. So just in general, you can see there's a large number of green creatures. I could have included a ton more on here. Plenty of monstrosity creatures which can dominate the board. A couple melee creatures in green. Melee is tertiary to green, and I believe there's only 2 overall, but those are still very impactful cards, with Fang of the Pack, in my opinion, being an exceptionally strong card. And then even Orchard Elemental has the potential to be really, really big, depending on how your opponents vote. On the other side, you've got cards like Strength in Numbers, which does grant trample, and if you're in a position to attack with a lot of creatures, can give a huge boost to one creature. Overrun is a hallmark limited card and absolutely busted in limited, allowing you to take out potentially multiple players in a given turn if you've racked up enough fatties on the battlefield. And then a little shout out to the card Natural Unity here. It is a hidden agenda card, so it is tied to a specifically named creature. But if you have multiples of pretty much any creature in your green deck, then this can help you build them up and make them the biggest presence on the board, which can turn any creature into a huge threat over time. Now, you might notice just by the size of this box, there are a lot of green rares. There are, in fact, a huge concentration of cards in this set that I would first pick, like very happily first pick, which is probably a little less true of some of the other colors. You've got Splitting Slime, which is a new take on Monstrosity, a 5-mana creature that curves perfectly into its Monstrosity ability, making it a 6/6 by turn 6, and then you just get to copy it. You can actually use this as a huge mana sink and just dump tons of mana into it without having to ever cast cards from your hand. And if your opponent can't deal with it, it can get out of hand very, very quickly. Birds of Paradise is the definition of first pickable in my book. I'm always happy to start off a draft with a card like this. It doesn't commit you to any colors, and it does help if you end up splashing other colors in your green-based deck, but Birds is absolutely first pickable. It is ramp in a mono green deck as well, so it gets all of your guys out a turn earlier. It lets you Monstrosity a turn earlier. It's exactly what you're looking for any green based deck, regardless of what color you might pair it with. Hedron Matrix is an interesting card in that I don't think it's actually really strong, but throw it on a trampler and suddenly you are dealing massive amounts of damage. Not to mention green is best poised to take advantage of making mana, which means that the equip cost is a little bit mitigated in green, whereas it'd be very, very expensive in other colors. Hedron Matrix is still a overly expensive card, but if you have a mass of tramplers in your deck, or you have creatures that can get through, Hedron Matrix is definitely something to consider and is very likely going to be passed by a number of players. Color of the Untamed, similar to the Savant in blue, is a way to play off-color cards in your green-based decks. There aren't a lot of creatures that happen to trump the green creatures in the format, but if you find something, or you find a double colored card or something like that that may be a little difficult, or maybe you just have another green card, you have tons of 6-drops and you can't afford to play them all, try playing Color of the Untamed and taking advantage of its ability to swarm the field. Selvala is really nice, and while I normally warn against using symmetrical effects in Limited because helping the opponent out is not normally something you want to do, I imagine you'll be able to take advantage of Selvala much easier than other people. This is the type of card that if you do first pick it, you start prioritizing really big creatures much higher than you normally would, and you might even go as to play a huge number of 5 and 6 drops just to make sure you're the one benefiting off of it the most. Keep in mind that the player only draws a card if it has the most power out of every creature on board, which if you're playing mono green and you've drafted quite efficiently and ended up in a really good mono green deck, Selvala is going to benefit you more than it will any other player. Not to mention that mana ability is just absurd with the right kinds of creatures. At its very least, it does ramp you ahead 1 mana, but start adding more power to the board and you'll find yourself slamming huge creatures for almost no cost up front. Selvala Stampede is a very tricky card. I think it's really easy to look at this card and imagine that it's a 4-for-1, or that you're just going to benefit very hugely off of it, but it does take a lot of setup in that you have to have a really stocked hand in order to make it good. Most players will see that you only have 2 or 3 cards left in your hand, and then everybody can collaborate and vote for you to just put permanents from your hand on the battlefield, which may not work out as well as you want unless you just happen to have tons and tons of 5s and 6s in your hand. However, have an open hand, and Selvala Stampede becomes a very strong card. Not to mention you always get a vote off of it too, so keep that in mind that it is more strategic than it's given credit for. I believe a lot of people see it and think best case scenario, but it does have the potential to just be a huge blowout for most opponents if you have the stocked hand when you play it. Regal Behemoth is nice, being a big trampler on its own and one of the only green ways to become the Monarch, aside from a couple commons, maybe 1 uncommon if I remember correctly. But that last ability, very similar to Selvala in ideal circumstances, just ramps your mana ahead so much that you can start dumping creatures or Monstrosity in creatures multiple times per turn, stuff like that. Or I should say triggering Monstrosity on multiple creatures, since you can't Monstrosity the same creature multiple times. But I think Regal Behemoth is first pickable and has very high upside. Berserk being the tier 1 pump spell that it is, while also doubling as a potential removal spell on an opponent's attacking creature, is just absurdly good, absurdly efficient, definitely first pick. You'll play it in any green-based deck because it does have that utility as a removal spell. But it's just a game finisher in a lot of situations. Play this on something that has Hedron Matrix on it, and you're essentially quadrupling its power. Pretty absurd. And then final shout out to a card that I'm a little inclined to think is not actually that good. Hymn of the Wilds. It makes your first creature spell each turn cost 1 less, but you can't cast instants or sorceries. Now, if you draft this, obviously your game plan suddenly becomes creatures only, and you can prioritize them, drafting tons and tons of really expensive high-end creatures. But Hymn of the Wilds essentially boils down to a Birds of Paradise that you can always assure you have on turn 1, and is not particularly amazing. Although if you do find yourself drafting tons of creatures and you just get past a bunch of green creatures, it might be something to actually consider playing, even though I think not being able to cast instants and sorceries is a huge downfall, because you lose cards like Berserk and Overrun and even instant speed removal spells. I believe Prey Upon is in this set as well, and you lose one of green's best way to clear the field of creatures. Anyway, thank you guys for watching. It seems as though the words at the bottom of the screen might be cut off here, but no matter. Anyway, thank you for listening to me stumble over my words again in a second video. Next time I'll be looking at white-blue because there is a Flyers deck here, which is kind of the standard white-blue thing, and I'm actually going to take a quick look into 5-color decks, which I believe are super viable in these kinds of sets. If you've played Eternal Masters, or if you've played, even Modern Masters 1 and 2, there were a number of 5-color decks that could crop up and actually do pretty well. They usually take the form of playing the best card from every pack, but I think it's a viable strategy here. Anyway, that'll be for next video, so let me shut up about that now. Anyway, my name is Timothy. Thank you guys for watching. I'd love your feedback in the comments below. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you all next time. Thanks for watching.